Okay, I have 3 o'clock, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Post-Fire webinar series. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the manager of Oregon State University's Extension Fire program. Now, some of you may already know, but for others that don't, the Fire program is a new program in Extension, and we are gearing up as we speak to help facilitate landscape scale, cross-boundary management projects on the ground, and also to provide education and outreach to all Oregonians. So much like our Forestry and Natural Resource Extension colleagues, the Fire program team will be living and working in communities throughout Oregon. For this post-fire webinar series, we will focus on impacts to forestry and natural resources on your property. So for example, impacts to water, soil, and vegetation. On October 1st, during the webinar titled After the Fire, Now What?, we heard from Extension and agency partners about an After the Fire checklist, which helps you to chart a course forward. That checklist is available online to download and also as a fillable form, which you can fill out just right from your smartphone. In addition to the checklist, the presenters recommended that you take photos and connect with your local resources and contacts. Then last week on October 8th, we learned about hazard tree assessment and burn severity and erosion. Information about these webinars can be found on the Fire program website, and the recordings can be found on the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube channel. My co-host, Mike Clousey, is adding these links in the chat box, and I will also provide resources to you in a follow-up email. I want to thank Mike Clousey for helping me co-host this webinar today. Mike is the Director of Forestry with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Mike and OFRE have been a longtime partner of OSU Extension Service, and we value that relationship very much. Thank you so much, Mike. I want to acknowledge here that many of you have lost everything to these wildfires that occurred this year. It is an extremely stressful and painful time with challenges that are affecting some of us in deeper ways than others. Please know that you are not alone. It is not our intention to undermine the severity of these losses, but to acknowledge with respect and as much understanding as possible. Thank you for being online with us today. Okay, logistics. Before I begin, I just have some webinar logistics that I'd like to quickly cover. The session is being recorded, and all webinar recordings can be found on the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube channel, as I just mentioned. We are also streaming live on the Extension Facebook page. Hey Facebookers! For you all in the webinar, your audio has been muted. If you are having audio troubles and are connected to your computer's audio, I suggest hanging up and dialing in with your phone. You can always post a question in the chat window. If you're having technical difficulties, Mike Clousey will be monitoring that chat window and can help you out. If you have a question on the information that is being presented, please type your question in the Q&A window. We plan to pause at several different times throughout today's presentation to have a question and answer session. Finally, you can adjust how you view the presenters by going to the upper right corner of your screen. You might choose to see all presenters at once or just the person who is actually speaking. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Steve Fitzgerald is with OSU Extension, and he is our silviculture specialist. Glenn Ahrens is our OSU Extension forester, who is serving Clackamas, Hood River, and Marion counties. Rick Barnes is a consulting forester with the Barnes and Associate. And from the Oregon Department of Forestry, we have Joe Goldsby. He's a stewardship forester for the North Cascade District Molalla unit. So we have a couple of presentations. Each of those folks are going to give a presentation, and in between presentation times, we will have time for questions. Now, if you don't catch all the information presented, don't worry, I'll provide the resources mentioned during this webinar on our fire program website under the webinar class guide. And I'll even follow up, like I said earlier, with an email just to be sure you get the information. Okay, so let's get started. Steve and Glenn, go ahead whenever you're ready.
All righty. All right, how does that look, Carrie?
Looks great, Glenn.
Okay, well, thank you, Carrie, and thanks everyone for being here. It's my pleasure to be here. My territory is in Clackamas in Marion County, and even though I didn't happen to get burned out, the fire was about a mile away, and I have plenty of closer places to look than I'm comfortable with to look for burn trees. So today, I'm going to kick off the whole show here. As Carrie said, we're all here to talk about assessing post-fire survival of trees and the potential for salvage harvest. So I'm going to start out on assessing trees. Steve Fitzgerald will start talking about salvage or not to salvage, and Rick Barnes really get into more of the details of salvaging, and Joe Goldsby will cover the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Forest Practices Act rules that apply. So with that, that's the lineup, and I'll go first, talking about assessing fire injured trees. And as Carrie mentioned, I want to touch bases with the after the fire checklist, which is now, I think, a fillable form online that you have the link to. And we will have resources posted from this webinar that you can see a lot of what we're talking about here after the fact. If you look closer at this fire checklist, what we're talking about today is really those of you who have been burned, get out and get a good look at your property and actually map it out. And when we start to look at where are the trees likely to die or not, and where is that on your land, particularly patches and also estimates within a patch of how severe it is. That's what we want you to get down to using a checklist or other kind of a mapping and listing of what you've got. So one of the things that Steve Fitzgerald and I are talking about, looking at the different situations, I've been out on many different sites since the fire and seen this spectrum of injury from very severe to very light. And the easiest way to think about it is the ends of the spectrum. If it's really lightly damaged, mostly green, versus the other end, heavily damaged, black or brown, that's pretty easy to make that judgment. And it's really in that middle ground, in that moderate to significant, where there's some kind of damage and you're not sure just how bad it is. That's where we really have more work to do, and that's what we're going to focus on today. If you look at just the kinds of things we look at, I'm going to start out looking at the stand level, but pretty quickly go into looking how do you look at a tree, and then and Rick Barnes in particular will kind of help put the stand level decisions in perspective. But when we think about the heavy or severe burn, we're going to be looking at the crown of the tree, the green part, or what was green, and if there's anything left or not. When nothing is left, the tree is likely to die. The bole is blackened, or the base and the roots, are they blackened or deeply charred? And then across the spectrum to that middle ground, and then the light effects where it's just pretty much intact crown and very light char on the ground. And if you look at kind of a visual here, just looking at crowns. So on the far left side, we have black. That was a crown fire, and everything was burned. And that's clearly, going to die. In this case, it's Douglas fir. The next one over is brown crowns, and those on Douglas fir, again, almost any species are going to die. If you go to the next one over, there's a little tinge of green on the top, and that's more that middle ground. How much is too much, so that the tree will die. And the far right, that did actually burn underneath, but the crowns are unaffected, and it was a light fire underneath, so that's the light end of the spectrum. And then, of course, if looking at this at a landscape level, you can identify those patches. You can see the black, the brown, and the green. And then, of course, it would be going into those green sites where there's some more moderate underburn that's going on that needs more attention in order to decide, how bad off is it. And if in this situation, looking at behind this house that burned, the whole hillside is black and brown. Well, that's unfortunately an easy decision that this is all severely burned and very likely to die. But then you get this case, which is more that moderate or middle ground, where there are green tops, and you need to get in and look closer and see what's going on the ground and how charred they are. In this case, it's Douglas fir and cedar and a little bit of deciduous trees behind this house in the Elkhorn area. Another thing to keep in perspective here is, depending on where you are in your objectives and your context, if you're looking at near a building or a home landscape, or if you're out in a a production forest, or in an area that you want to keep natural, or a natural area where not very much management is planned, your outlook on the probability of tree dying is different. So if it's near a home, or where you're going to rebuild a home, even a 30% chance that it's going to die, you may not be comfortable with having a tree like that near the home. But if you're deeper in the woods and you've got time, you can accept a higher probability it's going to die, and maybe give it more time to decide what's going to happen, or to see what happens. Another aspect to this is that trees damaged by fire are damaged, and in some cases parts of the tree will die, so that they can survive a long time. We've all probably seen healed fire scars that have grown over and the tree is still healthy. There will be a chance for decay to get into that damaged part, and a tree has to be pretty vigorous to overcome the injury and recover and grow. And so that's part of what you look at. And also, fire-scarred trees with partial decay over time, they become very good wildlife trees. So in that context, if you're looking at the wildlife value, you want to keep that in mind when you're looking at a tree and assessing what its long-term outlook is. So now I'm going to go into looking more at the tree level, individual trees, different species. And we've all been scrambling to look for the science-based information. And luckily, this very recent paper by Sharon Hood and others really put together decades of information on how trees recover from fire. And so they looked at thousands of trees of many species, the major conifers in Oregon and Washington. And on the right side here is just an example of the one-page cheat sheet that really has it all for a basic visual assessment of the various species based on its crown condition and on the char on the bark. So a lot of these slides pertain to that, and that's a reference that will be posted that you can go back to, and you can get that cheat sheet, page 29. And to put this in context, the crown is really the most important and the easiest to look at, and one of the first thing we look at. And foresters and others judging the vigor of a tree, we often rely on this basic idea of the crown ratio, or how much of the tree has a good healthy crown. And that pertains to how vigorous and stable the tree is. So if you look in the middle of this graphic here, with a 40% live crown, 40% of the total tree height has green branches, that's generally considered a threshold where those are considered to be stable trees, a tree that if you were to thin around it, or if it were left alone, it likely could stand up to the wind. And to the right of that, those trees are just have bigger and bigger crowns and are healthy and vigorous. It also relates to their ability to recover from injury, the size of their photosynthetic factory, and how it can, recover and grow and overgrow a scar. If you look on the left side, if a tree has a very small crown, and then fire comes and damages part of that, how much vigor will it have to survive? And so we like to evaluate trees based on this crown ratio before and after fire. And then if you look at, back to this publication and sort of the science basis of looking at crowns, the way we look at it is how much of the pre-fire crown was lost to the fire and scorched. And so if you look on the left side diagram and you just kind of guess, looking at the yellow as the scorched part, the green as the remaining green part, maybe 2/3 of that crown was scorched. If you look at the photos, again, from this publication, but also what many of us are seeing out there, they're both about a 50% reduction of their crown from what it was before the fire. And one on the left is sort of an even reduction, and the one on the right has sort of a one-sided thing, and you kind of estimate by batching it together and say, well, that tree looks like it lost about half of its crown, what it had before. And that's the basis of the ratings of how you judge how severe a crown scorch affected a tree. The other thing that we look at is the char of the bark, especially on the bottom. near the ground line, and I'll talk about that more later. So when you look at the char, the bole, and the base and the roots, first you just look at the bark, and this, looking at a heavily charred bark surface of a tree, if it's burned into, not necessarily to the wood, but it smooths out the characteristics so that you can tell it's so charred that you can't even see the characteristic pattern of bark on a Douglas fir or pine, and that's severe. Also, if the base of the tree has a lot of wood that was around it, woody debris that was consumed, and that fire lasted longer, it was hotter, it's more likely to be lethal to that tissue there under the bark and girdle the tree by killing the cambium and the live tissue under the bark. Or if there were roots exposed, like hemlock and cedar and other species growing on tree roots growing on old wood, that of course could burn hot for a long time, and I'll show pictures of that, and that would be heavy and severe damage to the base. The light end of the spectrum, hardly any effect on the bark, very light, and not very much of the circumference affected. You don't see a lot of evidence of the forest floor or the organic matter having been really deep and burned hot and long. You don't see roots and charred wood under roots. So we get back to that middle ground where there's some level of char, there's some evidence of burned roots. That's the ground that we really have to look harder to make a decision. And sometimes our decision is to just give it more time and see what happens. And it's important as you think of the different species, the thin bark species, which are hemlock and cedar and most of the deciduous trees, the true firs, those species are pretty easy to tell from bark char because they don't tolerate much. The thick bark trees like Douglas fir, pine, ponderosa pine, western larch, incense, cedar, it's harder to judge from the char the degree of damage and how likely the damage is lethal. And sometimes we look at, if we really want an answer, we chop into the tree with a hatchet. So on the right side, we're looking very closely where that red arrow is at that layer under the bark, the live cambium, which is between the wood and the bark, and also the phloem, which is what carries the food from the canopy down to the roots. And if that gets baked, then the tree will die, but maybe slowly over a few years. And so you can look at that directly, and if it gets dried and darkened over time, then that's a sign that it's dead. Now that takes a little study, and I'm not saying I'm an expert on that, and that's something we need to look harder at and probably have another session to focus on that. I'm going to run through some examples from the just extracted from that one-page cheat sheet that was in the publication. And you can always refer to that because that's a link online. But for example, with Douglas fir, all these examples say if it's got a greater than a 50% chance of damage exceeding what it can survive, so greater than 50% chance of dying. So for Douglas fir, it normally, on average, about 2/3 of the crown lost to fire is likely to be lethal, better than 50% chance anyway. On the bark char on small trees, they can tolerate maybe half of the bole circumference has any kind of char. That's likely to kill a smaller tree. Trees that are larger, 12, 20 inches or larger, it may take 3/4 of that bole to be charred in a fairly deep char where you really can't even discern the bark anymore. That's from the visual clues that they look at. And if you then look in the field, I'm going to go from kind of a light severity, just fires that I've been looking at here locally. This was a fairly light burn underneath, and the crowns are not affected. And so this would be on the light end of the spectrum. We would expect it to survive. And then this one, the ground fire was more severe, and the char is deeper and higher up the bole. Yet the crowns were not scorched. And so this one is more of a puzzle that we kind of look harder at the bole and perhaps give it time. In this case, fairly severe burning underneath. There was a fair amount of fuel on the ground from thinning, slash that was left. And then the crowns, if you look up, there's just a little green left, probably less than 10 or 15% crown on those. And right at that threshold, at least 2/3 of the crown having been scorched. And so this would be one of those stands that is kind of in that middle ground, but perhaps towards the severe end. And I know this landowner's decided they probably would start over with this stand. And then a case here, a clear, severe case where the bolls are black all the way up and the crowns were scorched all the way up. So that would be an example of kind of making those judgments. Now, pine is the other primary thick bark species that we see. And it's very different from Douglas fir in that it's one of those species that the buds often survive scorch. So with all the other trees, except for pine and I think larch, the buds are going to die when they're scorched, but in pine that's not the case. So we have a higher threshold for crown loss. With pine, depending on how much is blackened or scorched. And also the thick bark, you'd have to have more than 90% of the base with deep char before you're going to say it's got a pretty good chance to die. And so in the case of pine, again, this is an example from the publication. The buds are protected, and even with scorch, the buds often will leaf out. So there's an example here of the same tree, just after the fire, where it looks scorched pretty far up, pretty close to that, 75% crown loss. And then a year after, you can see it greened up from those buds that recovered. And then we are familiar with our larger thick bark pine being able to tolerate, ground fires, and that's some of the classic pine forest that has periodic fire, doesn't build up a whole lot of fuel, and it tolerates the char, and the crown is not damaged in this case because the flame lengths are not that high. So these should survive. And I'm going to run through some other species just fairly quickly, but grand fir, relatively thin bark, a little thicker bark than some of the other true firs, but even 50% char on smaller trees will kill them, but maybe 75% moderate char will also kill a grand fir, a larger grand fir. They're more tolerant to crown loss than say a hemlock, but they're pretty thin barked. And so here's an example of the grand fir that was fairly seriously charred, close to that 75% char on the left, but the crown doesn't look too bad. So that's kind of one of those in the middle ground, and you might want to just give it time and see. And then another case where it's a more severe char and also the crown is scorched, obviously beyond the threshold, and we'd expect this tree to die. And then the thin bark trees such as hemlock, hemlock doesn't tolerate much crown scorch at all, and also bark char of any kind around the majority of the bowl is likely to kill hemlock. And particularly the roots of hemlock are really vulnerable because they often have shallow roots and often are growing on wood. So you often see hemlocks killed because they just don't tolerate the fire, both around the shallow roots, the shallow thin bark, and also the soil. And similar with red cedar, larger cedar can tolerate more crown loss, but their thin bark doesn't protect them from fire at the ground. And even half of the bowl with any kind of char, even on up to 20-inch trees, is likely to kill a cedar. And so we often see, unfortunately, what I just saw in my neighborhood, some of the cedars in some of the nice areas that you wouldn't have thought, would have burned too hot, but they did under these conditions. And so most of those will die because of their vulnerability at the base, not so much the crown burning in this case. And even this tree on the right, trying to judge how bad is that char, it had a lot of wood around it and it burned pretty hot at the base. So we're afraid that these cedars aren't likely to make it. And one thing, of course, that anyone that's going out on these burn sites, you often see that where there was wood and a hemlock or a cedar that likes to grow on wood, and as that wood burns underneath it, then it's going to bake that tree from the base and it's not going to live. Now, these are all just the primary effects that I was talking about. The initial, lethal heat from fire or flame. And of course, then there's the longer term over the next few years. Are injured trees or even healthy trees near burned areas going to be subject to attack from bark beetles and secondary things that move in on fire killed or fire weakened trees? And so that's something, of course, we're going to need to be watching for. And there's things that we need to consider to prevent, if we can, by reducing the beetle food. So on the left side here, you see a lot of logs on the ground that were perhaps felled during the hazard trees or other, pre-harvest pre-fire harvesting that didn't get finished, unfortunately. If you left those might become prime sources of beetle breeding ground, as well as some of the standing trees. So that's something we're going to be having to watch out for over time. And there, in the case of Douglas fir, if you know that you've got a beetle problem shaping up and you have surviving trees to protect, then there is an option to consider with a hormone patch called MCH, and we can get perhaps Christine Buell or someone to spend more time on that if you want to learn more about bark beetles and bark beetle treatments. So that's kind of my pretty quick run through. If we think about the things to look at, just keep in mind you first look at the crowns and establish the degree of crown loss. And you can use, again, that formal science-based rating to start with to see what kind of crown loss that species could sustain before you'd expect a probability of it dying. In case of pine, the buds can survive, so you want to give them a chance and take a look to see if they recover. And then assessing the bole and the trunk from the char, the different levels. And this method of looking at the cambium, of taking either a punch tool and getting a plug out to examine the cambium under the bark, or using a hatchet, is really the best way to look at thick bark trees like Doug fir that have moderate char, such as the ones in this photo, to see, especially over time, if that cambium is dying, if you have the luxury to spend that much time looking at one tree. And also the visual clues around what's happening around the roots and the char, with wood built up around the tree. And then, of course, being mindful of how the different species react. And particularly this thing, if it was not a very vigorous tree before the fire and now it's damaged by fire, it's certainly in a weaker position to survive. All other things aside, if it was a tree with only a 20 or 30% crown ratio before fire and then it got scorched, it doesn't have a very good chance. And again, keep your eyes out for bark beetles. So Carrie, I went through that. Didn't want to get too deep into it, but I want to encourage folks to look at that publication and, and get back in touch with us. And I want to know what questions you have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Glenn. And that publication was provided for you in the chat window. There's a link directly to that publication, as well as back to the fire program website where all the resources are listed. So yes, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we have some already queued up for us here, Glenn. So if the tree has minimum to light moderate scorch, does it affect the integrity of the tree? Is the tree more susceptible to insect or disease or blowdown? I think you covered that, but maybe just quickly go over that again.
Yeah, in general, the light scorch would indicate that it really didn't suffer heat damage. And particularly, though, be careful that you're looking at the species, because hemlock and cedar and alder and some of the true firs and smaller trees, even a fairly light amount of char. Now we're talking about bark char, we're talking about crown scorch.
Yeah, they said, I don't think they said light to moderate scorch.
Well, scorch is considered the crown, so
okay.
I just covered it for the base, depending on species and how thick the bark is. So the light crown scorch, again, that's very species specific, because the hemlock, the estimates were that even if they had a 20% loss of crown, that's fairly light scorch for a Doug fir, but for hemlock, that's fairly severe. So it really depends on the species. And if you think about it, you're removing part of the photosynthetic factory of the tree, and it has to grow it back even to get back to where it was to sustain itself. So the more green it loses, the more in a deficit it'll be until it grows more foliage back. So any kind of scorch is a bit of a hit, but the severity depends on species.
Do you think that trees that have survived a fire may be better adapted to survive future fire? I would imagine it is species dependent.
Well, I guess if a tree survives the fire, that's certainly a sign that it's a survivor. That it, for whatever reason, if you can say, hey, that was a fairly moderate amount of scorch there, and it survives, so that certainly indicates it's able to survive that level. Now, of course, it could be weakened, and if it's a scar that comes from that, then the next fire might get to it a little more. So you've got to judge the tree by how it's doing, after the fire and how well it recovers.
Right. So question here from Marilyn, which species after being burned and died will last as a standing snag the longest for wildlife?
Well, Douglas fir does last a fairly long time. I'm not an expert on that, but there's some pretty good data from especially some of the studies that look at long-term fire, change and recovery after fire. So Douglas fir is one that lasts a fairly long time. I think the cedars can last a good long time, depending, though a lot of times they're vulnerable to having burned inside and they're hollow if they had rot in the base. But a sound cedar that didn't burn inside is likely to be fairly strong. A hemlock or an alder, is on the other end of the spectrum. And actually, if Fitz has any input on that, that'd be great too. But,
yeah, that's a really good question, Marilyn. A lot of it is species dependent. So as Glenn said, Douglas fir is a pretty good one, western larch, cedars. But the other part of it also depends on size. So larger diameter trees tend to last longer as an effective snag, and also whether they break off. So like in ponderosa pine, because they have a lot of sapwood, sometimes a tree will die, provide a snag, but not for very long because the whole thing topples over. But if it breaks off, it takes the weight off the top, and oftentimes shorter snags, with that top broken off, will last longer.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a good point.
And there are there is some research on the fall rate of different species. Ponderosa pine, lodgepole are two that I know of, and perhaps Douglas fir, but anyway.
And I should point out, as a west sider, the kind of fire I'm used to seeing are often the very extreme fires, because that's what tends to replace, when the conditions are those rare conditions when a heavy, moist Doug fir forest burns. A lot of times those fires can be pretty severe. And I'm seeing those, big old trees long after the fact, but I know that others have a lot of experience across a wider range of fire types. Other questions?
Yeah, so somebody asked here, would you please address the big black burn spots mid-trunk and how much damage they represent?
So the bole damage can be significant, and sometimes it's unusual that a tree will burn more up above than down below. But you would kind of want to use the same criteria if you could see it well enough. Is that scorch or that char deep enough to disfigure the bark? How long did it stay and how hot was it? The basal char tends to be more severe because there's more fuel on the ground. The fire is going to stay there longer. It's going to be hotter. But in the case where a really hot crown fire bakes through a bowl up higher, you'd want to look at the same kind of symptoms or characteristics of the bark and how deeply charred is it. Yeah, it could girdle the tree 50 feet up as well as it could at the bottom if it was hot enough up there for some reason.
Can you talk more about hardwoods like alder, big leaf maple?
Well, in general, what we know, the hardwoods, often their forest conditions where they grow are moister and fire behavior is often a little less severe. But when severe fire does burn through, they're pretty vulnerable. Maple is thin-barked, alder is thin-barked. They don't tolerate very much heat. They could tolerate more crown scorch, perhaps, if the leaves are, brown, but the buds are intact. But frankly, most of the research I've looked at is about conifers, and I haven't looked deeper into, hardwood crown scorch. It's generally the bole char and the thin bark that does them in.
Depending on the heat load, a lot of times they will resprout. So depending on just how hot it got around the roots. So there's for maple and some of those others, there's a chance that the top dies, but it can resprout, and that helps them retain them in the system.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because when we're looking at post-fire recovery and what's going to grow back, maple, of course, sprouts very vigorously, and cottonwood is likely to root sprout. Alder actually is not that vigorous at sprouting. A lot of your other trees like vine maple and some of the smaller trees are all likely to sprout. So that gives you an instant fire recovery of that vegetation, but you got to consider the pros and cons of that depending on your goals. Like if you want to establish conifers back, then you might want to balance that out. but they come back quickly as far as just revegetation.
And Glenn, what about lodgepole pine?
Well, I would probably go towards Steve on that because that's from his old stomping grounds. So tell us about lodgepole.
Yeah, well, lodgepole has fairly thin bark, so it's easily girdled at the base, even if there's not a lot of crown scorch. And depending on the last time fire was through, there can be a thatch layer that can smolder. Not as bad as what the thatch layer that ponderosa pine creates, but thin bark, and so they're highly vulnerable, and typically the fire regime in lodgepole is more of a stand replacement type of fire, but you can get creeping fire, and a creeping fire will kill a significant amount.
Yeah, and it's a very fire adapted tree by their cones opening and reseeding after fire.
Mm-hmm. So Glenn, in the tables referencing percent of bark char at the root collar and trunk, is the percent a portion of total diameter? Is there a factor for height of char?
Height of the char has an influence, but the basic is the percent of the circumference. Because, so if a tree has 25% of its circumference left alive, then theoretically it could grow back. And so if it's not entirely black around the whole circumference, that's what that percentage generally looks at. But if it's really severely charred higher up the tree, but that's only on one side, then the circumference is still what counts. Because girdling at one spot, it wouldn't really matter if it was only a foot that was girdled or 10 feet, it's still girdled if it's down near the ground like that.
And if our Doug firs are mostly in the moderate, maybe wait and see category, how long do we wait and what do we watch for?
So next spring, we will see how the crown leaves out. The bark char and the heat that kills the phloem, that can take a couple of 3 years even before it starves the roots, because what that's doing is cutting off the food from the crown going down to the roots. So the experts tell me that, you know, it may take 2 or more years for that bark char, the basal damage, to really kill the tree. And then the bugs, the insects, if they move into the neighborhood and the tree's weakened enough, that could start next year as well. Douglas fir bark beetles might fly next April, and then you'd see during next summer if that tree's getting attacked, and so you'd be looking for signs.
Mm-hmm. And then this will be our last question, Glenn, before we move on. When inspecting thick bark tree species for pole damage, what specifically do you look for in terms of cambium damage?
That's a good question, and one that I'm still asking myself, because I've been querying the researchers about exactly what it looks like, and we're still trying to make that clear. I've looked at photos, I've asked opinions. I mean, in general, if you chop into it, and the best thing is if you could chop into a live tree and see what that looks like, if you can bring yourself to injure that not live, but live and undamaged by fire, and then compare. And I still don't feel like I'm an expert on that, but that's something I think we need to fine tune and come up with a good set of criteria. But in general, it's going to be succulent, moist, look fresh, kind of light colored, from a light pale, whitish to a pale flesh color. And then as it dies, it darkens and it gets to be a darker brown or red or even black as it starts to decay. It's just that it's not easy to see that on these freshly damaged trees, and I think it might take a little more time. But you might have to go out and do your own investigations on that, as well as tune back in with us and see if we can come up with some better guidance with a photo series.
Steve, did you want to add to that before we move on?
No, he answered it perfectly. I think sometimes, like when the tree, let's say it just died, but the cambia can still kind of look alive. I think you have to wait a little bit before you begin to see when it's really dead, it's turning that brownish color. So I would say from here on out, that should become more evident.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, we're going to move on to the next presentation, but I'm going to ask the presenters online here as the panelists, if you could take a look at the other question and answers in the Q&A box and try to answer them in that box. And for you all viewing, go ahead and check out that Q&A for those answers, and we can certainly provide those typed answers in a Word document when I email you all after this webinar ends today. Okay, Steve, I think you are up next, and take it away whenever you are ready.
Let me share my screen.
Okay.
And all right, can everybody see that?
Yes, and you want it in the presenter mode.
I think it, oh yeah, right. All right, here we go. Okay.
Great.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's good to be back with you. I know this is a really tough subject. We're going to take a deeper dive into assessing the potential for salvage. And Rick Barnes will talk more about some of that operational stuff. I'm going to lay out some conceptual things, talk about wildlife a bit. And Joe's going to talk about some of the forest practices related to how do you conduct a salvage operation. So I wanted to pick up where I left off a couple of weeks ago, but really the primary purpose of salvage harvesting is to recover the economic value of trees that are damaged or killed. And oftentimes these are by unforeseen or uncontrollable events. So like a wildfire, could be ice, could even be a volcano. If I did this in 1979 before Mount St. Helens, I probably would not have included a volcano. But since I lived through that, now I add volcanoes into this as a disturbance. But salvage may be able to help with some other things. So it can help reduce some heavy fuels in certain locations and help you to create maybe strategic fuel breaks in certain places on your property. And it certainly improved the safety around homes, roads, and other infrastructure. And if the site you're going to replant, it can help prepare the site for that reforestation by removing some of the debris and heavy fuels. And as Glenn mentioned, that dead and dying trees provide habitat for insects. And in one way, that's great. But on the other hand, if they build up, they can then take out other trees and infest some of the wood and decrease its value. So in this salvage, sometimes this is a touchy subject. And I wanted to kind of put this up. The role of salvage really depends on you, and it really depends on how you view your property, how you are managing, and what your goals are. So some of you are maybe more passive managers, in that you're kind of have a property that you're leaving it for natural, like nature, aesthetics, wildlife. You're not really taking much of an active role in managing in any way. And on the right, maybe some of you where timber management is more important and revenue from that timber, and it's more of an investment. But I suspect that many of you are kind of in the middle here, where you have a mix of objectives of wildlife, maybe some income from timber, fire and fuel reduction, and maybe it's an investment or something you want to pass on to your kids. I say this respectfully, the need for and the role of salvage harvesting will be different depending on where you are in this management spectrum. The location of your property and the acreage that burned and the proximity of your property to other burned properties may affect what you might do. And of course, your economic situation might affect what role salvage might play for you. There were some questions on the first seminar about wildlife and snags and wildlife habitat. And I wanted to stop to kind of pause here a little bit and talk about disturbance and succession, because this is important in thinking about what are you going to leave behind for wildlife, if that's an important objective. So if you look at how after a disturbance, how a stand may develop, and this one here is not a perfect, but it shows a kind of a progression from an early grass forb stage. If this was a burned forest, we'd have obviously standing snags here. But over time, this may progress towards a forest, and maybe long enough, if we don't have other disturbances, maybe to a mature or old growth forest. We call this trajectory, this successional pathway, a sear. and it moves this way as it gets older. And we can break this sear up into what we call searal stages, and many of you probably have heard this. There's an early searal stage that right after the first few years to maybe a decade or so. There's a mid-searal, and there's a late searal, and the late searal will be equivalent to kind of more of a mature old growth type forest. Well, after a fire, of course, in this case, a patch that burned, killed all the trees, is that this is in an early, I would call this a mid-early searal stage, but you can see grasses and shrubbery that have sprouted. And it may last in this stage because there's no seed trees right here. It could last in this stage for maybe a few more decades until some trees maybe begin to seed in over a very long period of time. But this is a very important stage, and it's often forgotten about. And it's important because it's important for pollinating insects, birds, and small mammals. There's a lot going on here. Even though it looks like an open patch, there is a lot of activity from wildlife and insects. The dead and dying trees provide snags for both primary and secondary cavity nesters. And so primary cavity nesters are woodpeckers that actually excavate cavities. And those are and once they're abandoned by the woodpeckers, they're used by secondary nesters that are often like songbirds or other mammals that use them for homes. Now, in thinking about salvage and thinking about wildlife, is that we know that this is an important stage, and snags are really important. If you ever wanted woodpeckers, you're probably going to have some now. And what you can do here is you can find a balance between what you may want to salvage for value and what you want to leave behind for wildlife. So snags can be left individually, in groups, or in large patches. And so this might be maybe a quarter-acre patch, or maybe this could be several acres. And the leaf patches can be left unplanted to prolong maybe more complex early searal habitat in those particular patches or locations. And you may give up some revenue, but you may be able to enhance that wildlife habitat in this burned landscape. And so here's a case where both large and medium-sized trees were left after a salvage harvest, and the site was planted. It wasn't planted like a plantation, but it was planted to jumpstart some trees on this site since there weren't any viable leaf trees that might produce seed. And so here we have a pretty robust shrub community, and the seedlings are just starting to get above that. Okay, a little bit as we get into salvage, and this will preface the rest of my comments, but some definitions. So as foresters, we often talk about board feet. And so a board is 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch. We often talk about thousands of board feet is really the measure, 1,000 board feet, or sometimes we shorten it for MBF. Logs are bought and sold based on thousands of board feet, or MBF, delivered to the mill. Now, for smaller timber, a lot of times it's bought by the ton, but I'm going to stick with board feet, or MBF. So, for example, you might go to the mill and they might say, well, Douglas fir is going for $700 per MBF. That's delivered to the mill. So a log truck, just so you know, can contain anywhere from 5,200 to 6,800 board feet on that truck. It could be a little bit more, a little bit less, but generally that's most of it. So that's 5.2 or 6.8 MBF on that truck. Now, logging costs and log truck hauling costs are quoted also on an MBF basis. So just as an example, logging costs might be $150 per MBF to cut and skid and put the logs on the truck. The trucking costs to a mill may be $50 per MBF, depending on how far away the mill is. It could be $100 if it's a mill that's further away. So what would you net if a mill quoted you $700 per MBF? What would you net with these costs? So your $700 delivered to the mill, subtract off the $150 for logging to get it on the truck, and then $50 to get it from the truck to the mill. And so you would net somewhere around $500 per MBF. So if you were harvesting and you were harvesting 30 MBF, that's 30,000 board feet per acre, is that you would net about 15,000 bucks per acre. So that's kind of the rough economics kinds of things. So that's kind of a background for what I'm going to go into next. So I hope everybody kind of got that. So let's talk a little bit about how wood is measured, or in this case, scaled. So we look at the wood cylinder, a cylinder of wood in the log. And so it's measured from the small end of the log. You see that cylinder. And the wood is measured at the small end on the inside bark. We call that diameter inside bark, or DIB. And it's measured in 2 directions, and an average diameter is calculated. We also measure the length of the log in feet. And using a lookup volume table, we can determine the gross volume in that log that you see there. Now that's the gross volume. So sometimes logs contain defect, and so we have to deduct for defect and decay. And so we come up and calculate the scaling, the scalers that work at the mill. They calculate a net scale for payment. So you're paid based on the net scale as well as the logger. So we'll move on. So that's a little background. So let's take a look at some of the questions I posed at the very first webinar about, do you have enough volume to harvest? And Rick will get into some detail on this. In general, I mean, whether it's salvage or whatever, a logger usually likes at least 2 weeks of work, and this would be a very small job. And they would try to fit a small job in between their larger jobs. And in that work, they might, we need to look at what is the volume per acre that they might be removing. Is it like 5,000 board feet per acre, or 10,000 board feet or MBF per acre, or 15 MBF or more? Looking at some of the slides that Glenn showed, you definitely would be well over 15 MBF per acre. Now, a consulting forester can help estimate this for you, so that you have some information that you can use in talking with the mill or with a logger to try to entice them to take the job. So that's really important. So the next question I also posed a couple weeks ago: can you salvage quickly before the trees lose significant value through defect and decay? And so it kind of depends on the stand. So here's a 32-year-old stand, and here's a 40 or 50-year-old stand. The stand on the left probably would decay quicker because the trees are smaller than the one on the right. And so time is of essence really for both stands, but particularly for the one on the left. And so, as I think we talked in the first webinar, we mentioned that a fair amount of logging equipment was lost in fires, and that the demand for a logger will be high. So some of you may be on a waiting list if you're interested in salvage logging. And of course, that then has an effect on insects, decay, and weather checking on the logs. And that will come back to how much volume is available to salvage. So the longer it waits, the net volume goes down. And it's for these reasons. So over time, both insects, bark beetles, and bark beetles don't actually go into the wood. They feed on the outside and often finish off a tree, but because they eat the phloem. But bark beetles, like particular for pine, can introduce a blue stain, which degrades the quality of the log. But wood borers, these are actually insects that bore into the sapwood and create a definite defect. Stain is another one. Weather checking, so you can see this cross section with the splitting that you see on the outside. And of course, actual decay from fungi and of course breakage. As the longer the dead tree stands, things begin to break off from the top. And so if you look at this tree, is that it may have had a scaling cylinder all the way out if this was the small end of the log. And now because of the checking and other things, now we have a reduced scaling diameter, and therefore the amount of net scale is less after a few years. And so this is just some research that was done in Douglas fir, and you can see that over a 5-year period, you have a significant reduction in or increase in decay, as well as the amount of checking or cracking that you see. And so that'll reduce the amount of volume that you might be able to sell, depending on how far out you are with obtaining a logger. Another question I asked a few weeks ago was, what is the current or future log prices? Right now, the demand for lumber is high, and prices are actually pretty good. What we don't know, and maybe Rick can tell us more, is, will there be a flood of salvage wood going to market, and what effect might that have on log prices? And, what are your logging costs? Well, part of it depends on whether your logging costs are, your logging equipment is on ground, on flat ground, what we call ground-based harvesting. And that might range from $110 to $200 per thousand per MBF, depending on how much volume you're removing. And that's just an example. And then, so here is, here's another, here's a shovel logger that is cutting and placing the wood in a predetermined pattern where it will be picked up by a skidder and taken to the landing. If it's steep ground, and you may have to use a cable system, and this is more expensive because of the equipment needed, but logs are basically suspended off those cables that you see and brought up to a landing where you see the machine in green will grab the log and the tree and cut it into merchantable log lengths, and then load it onto a truck into the mill. And so the cost here is really dependent on the complexity of the terrain and access, and of course the amount of volume that you are removing. So here's a photo of an area that burned, and you can see in the foreground down in the lower right hand, it's kind of flat. This would be, we might use ground-based equipment, and of course the stuff in the back is on steep ground and more severely burned. So I'm going to throw up a busy slide here to think about how we might lay this out. So bear with me. So a couple of things here let me point out. So I pointed out where the ground-based equipment might be. There's about 8 to 10 acres down here in the lower part of this lower right part of the photo, and the rest back in the background is a large amount of acres that's very steep, and we might use a cable system. So let's start down at the bottom, and those ovals are landings, and going out from the landing are skid trails. And so some of this timber would be felled by a machine and then placed near the skid trail where a skidder could grab the wood and then drag it back to the landing where it will be placed on a truck and then go out the haul road that you see here. Please also notice that I've marked or laid out some leaf patches across this landscape, both small and large leaf patches, and so these would be left for wildlife purposes. And in the background, the landings there are for cable systems, and the straight lines would be the cable corridors on which they would drag up partially suspended logs to the landing, where then they would be cut into merchandised into logs and then put on a truck and would go to the mill. The trees in the foreground where I have the green diamond, those are just individual trees that I've marked to be left. Now, for any of you, you could leave more or less individual trees or patches of trees, depending on what your objectives are. A couple of things you have to be worried about, though, is because you have logging equipment and you have people out here, is safety is pretty important. And I think Rick's going to talk more about that. But basically, you really can't have any snags around the landings or within striking distance of any of the cables. So, so probably all around the landings, you would have very few snags that or patches that you would leave. The further away you are, the easier it is to leave those patches. And the safer it is. So anyway, I know that's a busy slide. I'm going to move on. But as I mentioned on wildlife considerations earlier is, you know, in those leaf patches, you can create complex early cereal habitat. They don't have to be planted. You can create or leave plenty of snag habitat. You may want to clump or put trees around other special habitats, seeps, springs, riparian areas, or maybe you had some large old trees that survived and leaving some other dead snags around them might be good. Now I want to say that not all snags are created equal. Snags where the cambium has been pretty much cooked is probably less desirable from a snag because bark beetles won't really, when you have bark beetles, you get woodpeckers. And so oftentimes that creates a better snag in the long run when woodpeckers begin to feed on it and create cavities. I'm not going to talk much about this because this is going to be the subject of our next webinar, but reforestation after salvage, we're going to talk about natural recovery from seed trees if they're present versus talking about planting trees and other vegetation, and talk about vegetation control to ensure that those seedlings will survive. So stay tuned for the next webinar on October 22nd. But going back to the checklist, you can refine the amount and burn severity of the vegetation. You might overall have a 25% of your property may have a low severity, 25% may be moderate, and maybe 15% would be high. And if you had a fairly well-stocked forest ahead of time, if this is a 40-acre forest and 40% of it was moderate to high severity burn, where you have a fair amount of mortality, that's about 16 acres, and that would be worth looking at from a salvage perspective. So with that, I think I'm going to end here to give plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. We actually only have a minute or two left here for questions, and I know that the panelists have been working hard in the background to answer your questions. If you go to the Q&A box, you can see those answered. If you don't want to distract yourself during the presentation, I'm going to send those Q&As to you in a follow-up email. I just want to shout out to Christine Buell from ODF. She's the entomologist with Oregon Department of Forestry. She's online as a panelist, as well as Daniel Lavelle, our state fire specialist with Extension, and also Lisa Christensen is online with us, Forestry and Natural Resource Extension agent from Douglas County. For those of you just tuning in on Facebook, we are looking at tree mortality today and salvage logging, so thank you for joining us. I think we might just roll right into the next presentation. We do have one question in the chat that I think we might have time for here, so let's just do it. Do all mills accept burned trees? Do the mills have a preference of tree species? Are the trees worth the same amount of money as an unburnt tree?
Okay, that's a good question. I just got a PO today from a mill. And if the wood is, you know, not just the bark is not black, but it's actually burned into the wood, The price was probably a third to 40% or less in that. If it's just got lightly charred bark and it's not into the wood, you should that you get full price. But Rick, I think, can answer that even in more detail with the experience that he's doing right now.
Great. So let's just roll right into Rick's presentation. Rick's going to talk about salvage planning and operational considerations. So Rick, whenever you're ready, we're ready for you.
You want to set it so you can set my video?
Let's
You got me
see.
blocked.
I do? Oh no. Okay. There.
There. Okay.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, let me start sharing my screen here. Okay, everybody see that? Chris?
I do not see that yet, Rick. You don't forget to push that little blue button at the bottom. That always gets me. That says share. So you got to share twice almost.
Okay, escape. Gotcha. Yep, that's exactly what I forgot.
That always gets me.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Looking good.
Okay, now you see that okay?
It's perfect. Thanks, Rick.
And can you see my mouse? Do I move my mouse around the picture?
I can, yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Glenn and Steve have done a great job of kind of teeing me up. They talked a lot about specific tree by tree issues, and I'm going to talk more at the stand level. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time dealing with looking at individual trees and thinking about what are they going to live, aren't they going to live? But I'm going to expand out a little bit more to the stand level. So, you know, as we start our post-fire activities, you know, the first thing we need to be thinking about safety. You know, there was a couple of weeks there where all we were worried about was the dangers from the forest fire itself. And now that the heat's gone or predominantly gone, certainly the safety issues are not at all gone. They're still very real and will continue to be there for quite some time. So that encourages you to walk around your property to really be paying attention to those safety hazards that are out there. You know, this tree shown on this slide, you know, is a good indication of that tree is going to come down sometime in the fairly near future. So just either, you know, fall that tree to get it on the ground, or certainly recognize that it's a safety hazard and stay away from it. You know, recognize that a lot of the organic material's gone, and we're going to see tremendous soil movement, or I anticipate we will. We've already seen a lot of stumps and logs go tumbling down the hills, and that will continue. And so just again, as you're walking around, be alert to that. Falling limbs, we've got a lot of dead limbs in trees that are going to, for years to come, you know, that's going to continue to be a hazard for those standing trees. And, you know, one of the hazards that's kind of unique to fires is the burned out stump holes. And, you know, there may have been a snag there, and now all it is a hole, and it's really a good trap for somebody to break an ankle or a leg. So just really be careful as you walk around your property. And, you know, recognize that those hazards, again, after every storm event, there's going to be, you know, more hazards that pop up. So, you know, as far as post-fire activities, the first thing we need to think about is getting these roads ready for the winter weather. The winter's coming at a high rate of speed, so be out there getting your roads open so you can, you know, analyze and assess the conditions after fire, but, you know, also make sure that your ditches are clean. Check your culverts, and if they need to be replaced, get them replaced now prior to a major storm event. You know, a culvert like this one here, right now would flow some water, but gets lots of water, and particularly with the the material that's on the ground. It wouldn't take much to get hung up in that culvert to block that culvert and make it not function at all. And sometimes culverts, you may have some culverts it's not real obvious that they're even there now. So just as you're looking at your roads, you see a situation where there probably should be a culvert, get out and do a thorough inspection to make sure that there isn't actually a culvert there that needs to be replaced. And again, this is a prime example that it will not take much for that soil to ravel down and plug that culvert totally. If we have road failures, we not only have the ecological damage that can create, but also, we've got the expense that it may cost $1,000 to replace a culvert, and it could easily cost you $10,000 or more to repair a road failure due to not getting that culvert replaced. So extremely important. And then, so that's kind of the road situation, and moving on to salvage or not to salvage. Again, we talked about individual tree analysis, but also let's take a look more now at stand level. One of the factors that's a reality is that we're going to have a huge amount of salvage volume moving, and with that, we need to recognize operators are going to become hard to come by. And so if we don't need to salvage and you can wait, there's some incentive to do that. This slide, one of the things that it illustrates is what happened in this situation was a fire came up through this young reproduction, was fairly hot and scorched the trees, killed the trees right along the edge of the timberline. And then as it got into the stand, the trees were less severely damaged. So, that's something to be considered. And at the stand level and situations where cable logging is required, it's not going to be possible to salvage this without taking some of this material, because you're going to be logging uphill, taking some of this green material out, which may die anyway, depending on how bad it's damaged, but take some of that out in your logging operation as well. Here's another situation where on the skyline, there's areas where most of the trees are dead. There's a few that are still alive, and will they make it? What percentage of those green trees are going to make it? Don't know. One of the things that I think about is this fire happened, late in the summer, and we'd been 95 days without water, significant water, rainfall. And as a result, the trees are pretty well shut down to conserve water. And so they weren't trying to pull moisture out of the soil. And so there may be some of these trees that are dead or will be dead next spring. When these trees try to wake up and start pulling the water, the roots may be damaged to the extent that they're not going to be able to function adequately to supply those trees. So, as Steve and Glenn talked about, time will tell, but certainly something for us to watch. Here's another mosaic of some property that we manage that we're thinking about, and the landings are going to be up on top. It's cable logging, and if we're going to salvage this material here, that's clearly, the vast majority of the trees are dead, and we leave the timber down here, it's going to be difficult for us to get the timber down here for the next rotation without destroying, because if we log it from up on this ridge, we'll have to come through our new plantation. So we need to think about our future harvests, and if we leave this now, is it feasible to log it, or will we have to either log it now or wait until this plantation is ready for its next rotation? So things to think about. Over on this area, again, clearly most of the trees are dead, pretty obvious salvage situation. Could we leave triangle here. Those are just things that, takes legwork and a lot of head scratching to figure out. It's another picture of a mosaic of just the realities of the fires we saw, that there's areas where it's clear, everything burnt, some areas where trees are clearly dead, but they still have some needles on it. And then you've got the areas where it looks like all the trees survived. And again, time will tell with that. One of the things about the fire that I was familiar with, the riparian areas got cooked as well as the rest of the area. So this is a situation where there had been a riparian area and the fire, killed all the trees in the riparian area. It is possible to request an alternate practice through the Oregon Department of Forestry, which Joe will talk about that a little bit later, but where you could go down to 20 feet from the high water mark on both sides of these streams. And so that's something that you may consider. You may or may not want to do that, or it may or may not be feasible to do that. Finding an operator, I'd mentioned, and Glenn and Steve both talked about it too, is going to be very difficult. This is a situation where, it's already being salvaged. This fire started, along with the rest of them on September 8th, and this photo was probably taken a week ago, so they've already been logging for a couple of weeks, really getting a jump on it. And it's going to be critical that we do that. If you have a small project, consider working with a neighbor. Steve talked about those small projects, and loggers would like to have a couple of weeks. Well, if you can tie a couple neighbors together and work on a project, that could be a really good solution for two reasons. One is it's a big enough project that you can get the operator there, plus the economies of scale of the move-in costs of all that equipment that can be spread out over multiple landowners. One of the things, with the small, any ownership, but particularly small ones, you always have to worry about, you're never very far from your property lines. And so you need to know where if you're going to harvest, where are your property lines? And we've gone out and inspected some lines that were in some areas pretty seriously burned, and that had been surveyed, and we were able to identify where those survey lines are and reestablish them. But in some cases, either they may not have been surveyed. So it's just something to be thinking about. Surveying takes time. Surveyors may not be available, and certainly probably won't be available in a time frame that's really going to help you to get in front of the curve with your salvage. And if you're going to cut against a line that you don't know exactly where it is, make sure you leave an adequate buffer so you avoid trespass. And with trespass comes along, depending on the situation, either double or triple stumpage is a general rule. One of the things in looking at the property lines that I would encourage you to talk to your neighbors if you don't know where that property line is consider a cutting line agreement. And basically what you would be doing is working with your neighbors, agreeing to where you think the line is, and there may be some give and take. Your neighbor might not agree exactly with where you think it is, but come to some agreement of a line you're going to use, and then agree to use that for the purpose of this harvest. And it's important it's a written document, so you have something contractual with your neighbor, but also it's important that it's clear that it's only for the purpose of this harvest. And you're trying to deal with a time sensitive situation, so you're determining this temporary property line, but in the future, or as soon as the harvest is over, then all of a sudden you would use the real property line once it's known, and you're not changing your description of your property or anything. It's just a matter of using it for the purposes of facilitating a timely harvest. Log prices have been good, quite good, and lumber and plywood prices have been extremely good. but the sooner we can harvest, the better, both to capture that market as well as the deterioration that's going to occur. Steve talked about it some, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail in a minute. If you're going to wait for better markets, we may see markets drop off significantly because of the tremendous supply. We've already seen markets drop off some due to log supply and demand. In my opinion, if you're going to wait, a high probability you're going to lose. We had a situation where a client decided to wait on a salvage due to the poor market. And it was a poor market, but a year and a half later, the market came back, and I tried to sell her logs, and I wasn't successful at doing that. The insects had basically made those logs worthless, so that material was just going to lay on the ground and be a fire hazard. So don't wait. Get after it. Recognize that you don't have a strong negotiating position, either with your selling your logs or in finding an operator. Just work diligently to get the best deal you can and move on. Time is of essence. Talking about, I know there was saw a few questions in chat, and I didn't answer them because I knew I was going to be showing some slides, but what will the mills accept? And one of the things that's important to recognize is chips, which is a byproduct of both lumber and plywood operations, is a very valuable end product that's used to help cover the mill's bottom line. It comes back to their bottom line. And chips cannot have any char in it. Bleaching for paper and so on, the char will not accept the bleach. So it's really a no-no. And so if you have logs, and this log that's shown here in this screen, you can see where it's burnt down into the wood, the mills are not going to want that log. And in some cases, they'll have a significant reduction in price. That's the best case. In other cases, they may have a no pay for that log. And in some cases, if they start getting a high supply of those, they may just cut you off and not accept your logs, and not willing to buy them. It's a real problem. This picture illustrates the borers. It'll build a gallery and bore into the log. You can see several instances here showing the insects, and once it gets to this point, significant loss in value for that log. This is kind of shows what the lumber would look like from that log. And there's several problems from the manufacturer standpoint. One is if they can dry the lumber, which many mills do have that capability, then that process will kill the insects. But if they're going to try to sell their lumber into the green dimension lumber market, there's the risk those insects are still alive. They could be put into a home, and the insects create problems. So there's huge risk and a strong incentive for the manufacturers to make sure that they don't have a negative claim. So they're really not kidding when they say it's a serious problem. This is a picture of veneer with the insect borers. This piece of veneer would have been premium grade for, ideal for the exterior plywood, but with these holes in it, it's going to have to be used in the core of the plywood. Still can be used, but instead of being a high value face veneer, it becomes a much lower value veneer, only acceptable in the core of the plywood. And with that, I guess as a forester, I'll say that, looking out at some of those fires, it just makes you sick. But just keep in mind, our forests are really resilient, and in the futures down the road are going to be beautiful again. So we got to keep that in mind and appreciate our forests for that. And with that, I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. Yes, go ahead, put your questions in the Q&A. We already have some loaded here for you, so I'm just going to dive right in. Let me just check on my time here. Okay, so Rick, what are the benefits to watersheds of leaving standing or downed trees in place?
Well, even the standing trees certainly will help if they're alive and will stay there. Then there's certainly the value from a wildlife standpoint, as well as being there to hold the soil in place. The downed wood, same thing, will help minimize the sediment and some of the erosion potential. But on the other hand, the opposite can be true too. If you leave some of those trees standing and they blow over and those roots come up, then you're dislodging a lot of soil with that process too. So it's, there's give and take.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Can you suggest how to use barriers or fencing to keep erosion debris out of culverts, but let the water through?
Yeah, I think the most common that I've seen are straw bales. And I know there's a big project right now working with some of the agricultural industry to help supply that straw for that sediment control. So that's one of the biggest things to do. And I've had, sometimes you learn from your mistakes, but we had a situation where I used hay instead of straw in a situation to prevent sediment at a culvert, and the cattle came in and just destroyed the area. So
no.
I learned that you got to be careful that your good intentions may backfire on you if you're not careful. So that's a reason why using straw or something that's not real palatable to our cattle and wildlife is worth consideration.
Very good point. For small landowners or patches, are there any secondary markets like firewood, processors, custom mills, hog fuel, etc., that will produce revenue from salvage? Or is it at best a break-even proposition?
I think at the most part, I don't know of anywhere it really will be profitable. Maybe in some cases you can help cover some of your expenses. But firewood is certainly an opportunity to generate some revenue. It takes a heck of a lot of labor to make firewood. So I do it, but only because my labor's not very expensive. My wife doesn't pay me very well for my firewood cutting.
Oh, that's great. Rick, is biomass a viable option for charred trees?
Yes, and that's one of the other things that I didn't talk about, but the char I talked about the char on wood, on the wood part of the log, but the char and the bark and the cambium, that really doesn't hurt the product at all. That can still go into cogeneration facilities, or if that blackened bark is broken down, it can still have fairly bright colors for landscape barking and so on. So that value is still there, certainly.
Great. And then the last question here for now, what are options for small landowners who aren't attracted to loggers, mills for salvage logging, younger trees, difficult terrain? Well,
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so what are options for small landowners who aren't attracted to loggers or mills for salvage, like the younger trees and the difficult terrain? Maybe they don't have the trees to log because they're smaller. So okay. What can you do if they're burned over?
Okay, yeah. So I would say that one option is just to interplant and plant right through those dead trees and let that next stand come up. That was probably,
I could put up my example, Carrie, if you wanted.
Oh, go for that. Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Can everybody see this?
Yeah, that looks good.
So if you're at the first webinar, John, his name's in the lower right-hand corner, had asked about, this is a situation where it's a Douglas fir stand. It's 18 years old. There's about 500 trees per acre, and there really isn't any merchantability in there to help pay for the removal. And I think what Rick said is, this is the proverbial, what I call between a rock and a hard place. And so what do you do with it? I mean, obviously, if this is all you had, you really are between a rock and a hard place. If you have some other merchantable timber, maybe you can help pay to do something here. But Rick and I had talked earlier about, maybe adjacent to the road, you masticate the trees to create more of a fuel break, but then underplant within that. Maybe put a fuel break around the entire stand. This right here doesn't look very steep, but it could drop off. So I think, this is the most difficult situation because you don't have any viable trees to help pay the reforestation. But if you want to get a stand back into production, forest back, I think you could use some selective mastication in places to create a fuel break and then underplant through that. That is one kind of option.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box, so I think we might just, let's see here. Oh, and we're right on time, so let's just roll right into the presentation on the Oregon Forest Practices Act from Joe Goldsby with Oregon Department of Forestry. Joe, whenever you're ready.
Okay, can everyone see that?
I sure can.
All right. So my name is Joe Goldsby. I'm a stewardship forester for the Department of Forestry in North Cascade District in Molalla. I'm going to be going over forest practice rules in relation to salvaged harvest post-fire. So a document that can help you learn more about Forest Practices Act in general is the illustrated guide, which is produced and distributed by OFRI. It's available online, electronically, but also I know we do have some limited supplies at ODF offices. And then also on the ferns picture on the right side there, that is the web page. If you're conducting a commercial forest activity in Oregon, you have to file a notification prior to beginning the operation, and that is done through the Ferns website. You can do that from your home computer, or also most ODF offices have a computer at the front desk where you can come in and have the notification filed there for you. So salvage, in regards to Oregon Forest Practices Act requirements, the Forest Practice Act rules that applied prior to the fire still apply now. It includes procedural requirements as well, such as notifications, written plans for alternate practices. But there are allowances to modify certain rules or statutes due to fire mortality. A couple of terms I'm going to be using a lot are written plans and plan for alternate practice. A written plan is just a document that includes a map which identifies a protected resource within an operation area, the activities that may affect that resource, and then the methods that you're going to employ to protect that resource from damage during the operation. A plan for alternate practice is similar in that you're identifying protected resource. The difference is that you are looking to alter the protection standards or methods that are listed in rule, and in this case it would be due to fire. So the first one I'm going to cover are large continuous acres that have been burnt. In statute, there's a 120-acre limit on Type 3 harvests, which are more commonly known as clear cuts. So in the situation of fire salvage, there is no statutory upper limit to the size of harvest. That said, there are other constraints on notification. Ferns, the online program, can't accept a polygon greater than 3,000 acres. So for some of the landowners that own a lot of acreage, this could come into effect. But also resource review for the forester gets tougher as the acreage increases. We have to review on every acre for protected resources. And so a 3,000 acre notification can take a long time to review, and increases the potential for the forester to miss some protected resources. And so kind of the guidance that we've received and we're giving out to landowners is to limit salvage notifications to 640 acres at most, and then if you need to do more than that, just file multiple notifications. So the method to exceed a 120-acre clear-cut limit is the plan for alternate practice. And the 120-acre is based on total acres that have not met free-to-grow requirements, not just the acres that have burned and you're salvaging now, but if you look at the picture, the upper picture, acreage and clear-cut size is based on adjacent units, and adjacent units don't necessarily mean they're right next to each other. In terms of clear-cut acreage, 2 units are considered adjacent if they're within 300 feet of each other. And so if you had an existing clear-cut that hadn't met free-to-grow yet, and then the fire also destroyed a bunch of acres that you're now looking to salvage harvest, you may need a PFAP. The example I've listed is if you had a 50-acre unit you planted 3 years ago, and then next to that was a 100-acre of fire salvage that you were going to be conducting, your total acreage would be 150 acres and would require a PFAP. So it's important to look outside of just the area you're harvesting and what else you have on your ownership, because you may need a PFAP to exceed the 120 acres, even if you're not actually harvesting that many. Next, we're going to look at salvage and riparian management areas. It's a picture of a RMA that's been damaged by fire. So there's several options for managing RMAs. All of them for fish streams or domestic streams require a written plan. Some of them also require a plan for alternate practice. Just the basic, at the basic level, all the normal prescriptions are still available. So just like if the stand hadn't been damaged by fire, I mean, you're just harvesting normally, you could utilize one of those harvest prescriptions within the RMA. The next available option is called site-specific prescription. This also is available always for landowner, fire or not. And these prescriptions can be applied to stream, lake, or wetland RMAs. And this one does require the plan for alternate practice because you would be basically writing your own prescription, what you want to do within the RMA in order to get the stream or lakeside buffer back into live trees. And this is also something that the forester would want to come out and look at your stream or lake and discuss what type of prescription you're thinking of implementing. So this buffer right here would be a good candidate for a site-specific prescription, as it looks like there's only 2 trees with green crown that may have other damage that will cause mortality. There's also alternate prescription 1, which is in rule, and so this does not require a PFAB, but it still requires a written plan. If the RMA qualifies, which to qualify, you need to have half of what is normally required alive within the RMA. If you have less than half of what's normally required, you'd qualify for this alternate prescription 1. And also, we're currently working on an easier to implement option than this prescription, but nothing has been produced yet. The kind of issues with implementing this prescription is it requires you to measure the basal area within the stream buffer to see if it would qualify for this prescription, and then also you need to leave a certain amount of basal area. It also can be a safety hazard within the current condition with trees falling. And so we've kind of been focusing more on site-specific prescriptions, but if an easier implement option comes out, this may be the preferred way to go. And then wildlife leaf trees, clear-cut harvests over 25 acres require two leaf trees per acre. And so on landowners that have conducted these larger clear-cut harvests that have wildlife trees that have burnt up, some of them may wish to salvage the wildlife trees and relocate them to another location. Method to do this would be through the plan for alternate practice, but the plan would have to demonstrate better overall benefit for wildlife. With the salvage operations, the leaf tree requirements are still in effect. So if you're salvaging over 25 acres, you still would be required to leave 2 live or snag trees per acre based on the total acreage of your clear cut. And similar to how you calculate the total acreage, if you had a 15-acre clear cut that's 10 years old, and then you're doing 15-acre fire salvage adjacent to that, your total acreage would be 30 acres. And so while each individual operation doesn't hit that 25-acre threshold, the total acre does meet the 25-acre threshold, so you would need to leave trees for the entire 30 acres. Finally, some other kind of more specific things. High landslide hazard locations and specified resource sites are a couple of the other protected resources they're seeing kind of more common come up in these salvage. High landslide hazard locations are slopes in western Oregon above 80%, or within a head wall or draw slopes above 70%. And these have to be reviewed for public safety, so if there's homes below or roads that receive a certain amount of daily traffic, there may be harvest restrictions on those slopes. And then also specified resource sites, threatened and endangered fish and wildlife species or sensitive bird species. Should be spotted owl, osprey, bald eagle, for a few examples. All the rules still apply on these, and we do operations with these resources will require the review and possibly site visits from the forester or Salem specialist staff to determine what protection requirements need to be in place. Just an example, modification may be made currently in discussions of whether it's more beneficial if a steep slope can be salvage harvest with limited ground disturbance. It may be more beneficial to harvest those slopes and get new trees planted to, in the long term, increase the slope stability. And then similar with the specified resource sites, depending on the level of damage and what all has occurred around a protected nest site, rules may be able to be modified to assist in the salvage harvest. And so for assistance with any forest practice related question or even assessing your timber for survivability, you can contact your local stewardship forester. At least in our district, where we brought in some outside foresters from other districts to account for the increased workload. There's also a document that discusses salvage in relation to the Forest Practices Act at that link on the screen. And then there's several agencies that are providing financial assistance, mainly for assistance on reforestation on these younger stands that aren't merchantable. So the landowner is incurred in all cost, and there isn't any revenue generated from salvage harvest. And those are Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Farm Service Agency, Oregon Soil Water Conservation District, and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And the contact information for all those is right there on the screen. And that's all I have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joe. You already have a question in the chat box. And just a reminder, Joe just shared a lot of great, useful links right at the end. Those are all on the FIRE program website. I will send you that link to the website so you can get at those resources. But Joe, is there a diameter required for wildlife leaf trees?
Yes, so a tree would qualify as a leaf tree. It has to be a minimum 11 inches in diameter and 30 feet in height. And it is a two tree per acre requirement, and at least half of the trees have to be conifer.
Okay. Okay, so get your questions for actually any of the presenters into the Q&A box. Like I said, a lot of those questions have been answered by the presenters, but if anything else has popped up while you've been listening in for any of the presenters, go ahead and put that in the Q&A. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here to show next week. Please join us, same day, same time. That's Thursday, October 22nd at 3 p.m. for presentations on reforestation considerations after wildfire. And so this is really cool. I just learned this. There's a QR code on the screen here. If you take your smart device, and here I have a smartphone, and you click on your camera, and you just aim your camera at that QR code. You don't even have to take the picture. The website pops up. And that is so cool. I didn't even take the picture, and there it is, the website. So check that out. That's an easy way to get to the FIRE program website. Is there a definition for forest land that would help landowners who only happen to live on forested property to know what rules apply to us?
Yeah, so forest land is any land which is used to grow and harvest tree species. And that's regardless of how it's zoned or taxed or any local ordinances or anything like that. So if you're conducting a commercial operation, harvesting trees and selling them, then it's considered forest land.
So if you're growing trees for profit, it's forest land. Yep. What are the differences for modified harvest rules when it comes to public versus private lands?
So private lands, and then also, I guess an example would be county-owned lands, at least in Clackamas County. Minimum protection requirements are the Forest Practices Act. And then if you were to look at something like state forests, their minimum requirement is to meet the Forest Practices Act, but they have their own forest management plan that provides increased protections. And then federal lands operate under their own rules, and they're not bound to follow the Forest Practices Act.
Okay. Well, while we wait for more Q&A to come in, are there any last-minute thoughts from the presenters that you might have, come up with as you were listening to the presentations along the way that you want to make sure people know?
I have a couple.
Go for it.
When we were looking at the younger stand or Steve Fitzgerald's rock in a hard place example, there's a lot of lands that were either brushy or young trees that aren't going to be salvage logging, and we're definitely going to address that a lot in the reforestation section. So just want to invite people to go to that one, because there may be sources of assistance under those sources that were listed there in Joe's talk for restoration and extra work to plant some of those areas that don't have merchantable timber for salvage logging. So I'd say tune into that, and also, ask questions and contact some of those agencies like the NRCS Farm Service Agency to see what kinds of programs might help with some of those lands that aren't, being salvage logged. Another thing I thought of, since the bark beetle topic came up a few times, and we have Christine Buell as one of our panelists, if you wouldn't mind directing folks where to learn more about bark beetles, Christine, because that is going to be something, both beetles and those wood borers, and Christine knows a lot about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you don't mind me jumping in a little bit. So all of the presenters did a really good job of covering a lot of the high level information about potential insect issues subsequent to wildfire damage. So I do want to give a nod again, as Glenn mentioned, the Forest Service has an excellent publication they just put out. The link is in the Q&A. It is 61 pages. A lot of that is tables per tree species. They really get into the details. It's a comprehensive review of all the research that's been done in post-fire mortality in the Pacific Northwest. So it's very region specific, which is really important because it's going to differ from a lot of the work done by the Fire Research Center in the Rockies. So definitely check that out. And I will be producing a truncated version of that and put on our ODF Forest Health website. So you don't have to read through the whole thing if you want really high level information, and then you can get into the nitty gritty. And our website, if you saw the link earlier, is the Forest Health website, but you can also just Google Oregon Department of Forestry, Forest Health, and we have a multitude of training videos and fact sheets that give you more details about some of the insects that were mentioned. In particular, the bark beetles coming in, killing the trees. That's a huge outbreak issue that we want to be aware of in terms of sanitation and salvage to try and reduce the numbers of those insects on the landscape. But then also the wood borers that are going to be coming in after the bark beetles, typically as the first stage of decomposition. But so even though they're not killing the trees, they are causing defect in their feeding tunnels. And all of these things were mentioned by the previous presenters, but there is more detailed information on our website about specific insects that you're going to be looking for. I would suggest that, since we are talking to typically a Doug fir and ponderosa pine audience, that you look at the Douglas fir beetle fact sheet. There's also an MCH fact sheet. That's the pheromone that Glenn had mentioned. That is a preventative agent. And then if you're looking at pine, specifically looking at the IPS bark beetle fact sheet and the slash management fact sheet. Those two are going to be really important because those are the two insects that you're going to contend with the most post-fire. We also have a wood borers fact sheet that can be informative as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christine. And Mike and I both at the same time put that link back in that chat box for you. So go ahead and check that out. We do have a couple more questions that have come in. If your property is listed as rural residential for tax purposes, does that change in the case of almost all land is forest that is burned? And let me see if I read that right. If your property is listed as rural residential tax purposes, does that change in the case of almost all land is forest that is burned?
So I don't fully understand the question, but I guess the tax classification of your property would not affect if you were conducting a commercial harvest, selling the logs to a mill. The Forest Practices Act would apply in any of these written plan or plan for alternate practice things that I discussed would apply and could be utilized for salvage.
We have one more here. Can very large trees be cut down so they be more acceptable to mills?
Well, certainly very large trees can be cut down, and they are, mills will buy them. Certain depends on where you are geographically, but there are mills here in Oregon that specialize in cutting large logs. So that's certainly the case. And as far as increasing the value, I'm not sure what that part of that question was, but
Yeah.
certainly there are mills out there that are very interested in buying large trees.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, with just a couple minutes left here, I want to just say a huge thank you to all the presenters who provided a lot of great information today. Rick, Joe, Steve, and Glenn, thank you. Christine, also for jumping in. Daniel and Alicia in the background helping to answer questions. Really appreciate that. And then to you all, thank you for joining us via this webinar and also on Facebook. We recognize this is a difficult time for so many of you, and we really appreciate you tuning into these webinars. Webinars are just one way we provide information to you during this time of COVID when we can't necessarily be face-to-face. This webinar, like I mentioned, has been recorded, and feel free to share it out. And if you have a moment when we close down the webinar, tell us what you thought about today's presentations by filling out a very brief survey. Again, that survey will pop up. It literally takes maybe a minute or two. And before I just completely close out here, one last question. Can you help locate those mills that cut large trees? And I think there's a forest industry directory, and maybe that question was just answered.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
I just answered. It's the Forest Products Industry Directory maintained by the Extension Service, Scott Levengood in the Wood Innovation Center.
That's right. That's right on. Okay, just checking the chat here to make sure that we didn't miss anything. Mike, are you seeing anything that I might be missing?
Just a lot of thank yous.
Great. Well, with that, again, thank you all. Stay safe, everyone. See you next week, I hope, and have a good night.